So, to start off, let's think a little bit about South Carolina's current landscape when it comes to our energy sector. Uh, at the league, we focus a lot on engaging around the electric utilities, and South Carolina is fairly unusual in the amount of nuclear energy that we have on the grid. In fact, the majority of the power that's produced in our state is nuclear by a somewhat slim margin. After nuclear is gas generation, which makes up about a quarter of the generation in our state. And that's been rapidly growing in recent years, due largely to hydraulic fracturing, which has enabled an increase in production and lower costs, and has increasingly been displacing coal, which is now down to 14%, and is expected to continue to decline due to worsening economics. Solar energy has been really promising and is growing, although it only makes up 3% of the installed capacity in our state. And increasingly, solar is also being paired with large-scale battery storage, which helps to resolve the intermittency issue, so that it's always available when demand is on the grid. We also have a little bit of biomass generation, including landfill gas, which is, a great opportunity to get some energy off of the gases that seep out of landfills rather than releasing it. And we also have some hydroelectric generation, but that's largely held steady for decades with the viable sites pretty much tapped out. We have four major nuclear plants in South Carolina, and this map shows you where they are. And to the right, you can see a comparison to other states in terms of how much of our generation is coming from nuclear power plants. On the bottom right, as you'll see, we are ranked third in the country in terms of uh, how many megawatt hours or how much power is produced from nuclear power plants. And we're actually number one. If you look at the numbers on those bars, at 56%, we're number one among the states that produce a lot of nuclear power in terms of the overall percentage on our grid. Only New Hampshire down there at the bottom has a higher share of its overall production coming from nuclear, but they're a pretty small state. So, how does the cost of energy compare across these different technologies? That's a really important factor that drives what the regulators will approve for the next generation of our grid. Um, if you look at solar PV dash utility, which is down in the third row, that's a really key number there. On the low end, it can be as little as $29 per megawatt hour. Compared to rooftop solar up on the top row, which uh, typically doesn't get below $122 per megawatt hour. So the scale is important. But with large scale utility scale solar, it's able to come in at a lower price than really anything else. This is a national analysis that's updated every year and is widely considered an industry standard on Wall Street. The only power source that can be a little cheaper is wind energy. And unfortunately, we don't have the greatest wind energy resources in South Carolina. None has been built yet. It could be potentially cost effective, but it's not as much of a near-term opportunity as solar. If you look at the bottom row, that's the main competitor for solar, for what's going to be built next. That's combined cycle gas. And by combined cycle, what's meant by that is that it combines a combustion turbine, which is essentially like a jet engine, with a steam turbine where there's a boiler, and it takes waste heat from the combustion turbine to boil water and then turn a steam turbine. And that's more efficient than just a combustion turbine on its own. It's much more efficient than just using a burner under a boiler and a steam turbine. Um, but there's still a lot of concerns with relying too much on combined cycle gas, which we'll get more into. So you can see it's cheaper than coal, which is in the row above that, and a lot cheaper than building new nuclear generation, which is in the row above coal. Now, the existing nuclear plants we have are fairly cost effective to keep online, but as we learned with the VC Summer expansion project that ultimately failed in 2017, new nuclear has been plagued with cost overruns and delays. So what are the main uses of energy in our state? This breaks it down between the four major sectors. And now this includes all types of energy, so not just electricity. Um, but industrial is currently the biggest piece of the pie, followed by transportation, then residential, and then finally commercial at a little above half the amount that is consumed by the industrial sector. We're anticipating the industrial piece of the pie to grow the most. So that's really the biggest challenge that we're going to be faced with as we contend with what's being built next. So, how is demand for electricity changing? Well, we've been fortunate over most of the past 20 years that demand has been pretty much flat. And that's largely thanks to improvements in energy efficiency. And for residential customers of the electric utilities, efficiency has improved so much that it's almost fully offset the growth from new people moving here. And, you know, in some years, we've been among the top growing states in the country. Percentage wise, we were number one in 2023. Dropped off a little bit in 2024. But that just really demonstrates how powerful energy efficiency improvements can be. Now, we've still got a long way to go, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. But the real challenge that we're facing in our state right now, and in many other states, is this new phenomenon where the utilities are forecasting a rapid growth in demand for the first time in decades. And this is primarily due to large hyperscale data centers. So these data centers are being built at a rapid pace due to the adoption of artificial intelligence technologies and the increased use of cloud computing services. There's a lot of uncertainty, though, in the load forecasts that the utilities produce as part of their long-range planning processes. Uh, the the two main utilities that are serving coastal South Carolina, Santee Cooper and Dominion Energy, are forecasting about two-thirds of the load growth to be coming from data centers. But the data center developers are simultaneously looking all over the world and talking to lots of different utilities for each potential data center they're considering building. So they're certainly being double, triple counted or more. There are also companies that are not affiliated with the actual data center developers, but are out buying land speculatively and trying to negotiate service agreements with utilities with the hope that they can then flip those deals to data center developers, the big tech companies like Google and Microsoft and Meta. Um, so it creates further challenges with uncertainty as to whether this projected load growth will actually come through. And, you know, if it doesn't, and the utilities have built billions of dollars in new power plants and other assets, we're going to be stuck with the bill. Even if they do come through, we're going to have to help pay for them just because of the way that costs are distributed in our state's regulatory policy, which in the past made a lot of sense, you know, as uh, demand was growing kind of organically across a lot of different customers, like in the 60s when people were first getting air conditioners. It was pretty fair to just spread the cost of a new power plant to everybody, with some differences based on what class you're in, how much you consume, um, where there are certain fixed costs that might justify a little bit higher rate for people who don't use as much power. But now we have this issue where there are just a handful of facilities being built by some of the most valuable corporations in the world that are responsible for pretty much the entire need for billions of dollars in new power plants. It doesn't seem right that we should have to help pay for it at all. And it's especially not right to put that burden on a lot of low income communities in rural South Carolina. Now, the data centers have been lured here pretty deliberately. They are specifically exempted from paying any state sales tax. That includes not only all of the expensive server equipment that they install, but also the electricity that they consume, which is their major operating expense. Um, that I already mentioned kind of the energy cost shifting issue, that we're going to have to help pay the light bill for Google and Microsoft if we don't change something and pass some new consumer protections. They also consume a lot of water for cooling, which is another problem. And there's kind of a trade-off there, that if they reduce their water consumption for cooling, that's going to make their energy usage go up even more to do air cooling. And like Judith mentioned, they don't create a lot of jobs. There were a couple of 200 megawatt hyperscale data centers recently announced in South Carolina, and one of them is creating 30 jobs and the other's creating 27. And, compared to a factory that uses not even as much energy as one of those data centers, they could be creating thousands of jobs, depending on the industry. And there's a real opportunity cost here where if we build out all the possible power plants that we can get given constraints in the supply chain and just how long it takes to build them for data centers, we can't also build all of that generation for industries that might be more beneficial to the state. Um, of course, building all of this infrastructure creates a lot of environmental burdens as well, which I'll talk more about. So, on the cost side of things, an important term to understand and something that we want to talk to our state's leaders about is energy burden, which is just the percentage of a household's income that's spent on home energy bills. South Carolina is among the states with the highest levels of energy burden, and low-income families are especially hard hit. Uh, Department of Energy study a couple years ago found that South Carolina had the second highest energy burdens in the country behind Mississippi. Um, and the factors are of course low income, but also we have really inefficient housing, hot summers, and our electric rates have been going up and are starting to get a little higher than some other states. And climate change is going to make it more and more expensive to try and keep homes cool, or really just a base level of safety and health in the summer, especially for folks with health conditions. So, what can we do about it? Well, energy efficiency is a great solution. I've mentioned earlier how it's helped to offset the growth in demand from people moving here, but we're unfortunately also one of the worst states in the country on energy efficiency in terms of the savings that are achieved from the programs that are offered by our utilities. Now, these programs have to pass cost effectiveness screening so that they're proven to avoid more expensive alternatives like building new power plants instead. But the utilities are fundamentally disincentivized from really fully investing in energy efficiency because it's not as profitable for them. But it can directly cut people's bills by upwards of 30%. and then save everybody else money, even if you don't participate in them, because we won't have to pay for new power plants potentially. Um, so Duke Energy in the upstate and the Grand Strand is actually the best in the Southeast when it comes to energy efficiency programs. Our other South Carolina utilities have some room for improvement, but the Southeast is also the worst region in the country. So even Duke has a long way to go to catch up with national leaders. So how do the utilities plan to meet this projected demand growth? Well, unfortunately, they're looking at delaying their planned coal plant retirements. There are five remaining coal plants in the state, four of which had tentative retirement dates established over the past few years, and they've all been repeatedly pushed back and are likely to continue to be pushed back. They're also looking at spending billions of dollars building new gas-fired power plants. I would expect that the share of different generating technologies, like we saw earlier, will shift where it's going to change from about a quarter gas to about three-quarters gas if the utilities plans all come to fruition. Some of those will also run on diesel some of the time, which is much more expensive and dirtier. Um, the utilities are also continuing to add a small amount of solar and battery storage. They could do a lot more. And unfortunately, they continue to plan on underinvesting in cost-effective energy efficiency programs. So that's kind of where our work is cut out for us. These are the things we need to try and change. One of the big planned developments that we've been focused on fighting for a couple years now is a proposed combined cycle gas plant on the Edisto River at the site of a retired 490 megawatt coal plant in Cannady, South Carolina. It's on the Colleton County side of the river. Um, Originally, that plant was planned to be about 1,300 megawatts. Then they kept increasing their plans. The latest statements I've heard were 2,200 megawatts. And this would be a joint project between the state-owned utility Santee Cooper and Dominion Energy. If built, it would be one of the biggest gas plants in the country. The utility executives have floated different rough capital cost estimates, and the most recent and highest have been $3 billion. It could be significantly more than that once they make their final proposal with real numbers to regulators. And of course, there's a track record of cost overruns even after they get an initial plan approved and once they start actual construction. This is a picture of the site from an airplane. You can see the Edisto River down on the bottom left. So methane gas has a problematic supply chain from wellhead to burner. Uh, it starts off with hydraulic fracturing. In other states, we don't have any fossil fuel or uranium production in state, so we got to import all our fuels. Um, a lot of it's coming from the Marcellus Shale around the Appalachian Mountains, especially in like West Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York. And they inject a cocktail of sand and water and sometimes more than 100 different proprietary chemicals to break up these shale rock deposits where they're tiny pockets of methane gas that they then release and pump up through oil rig looking well. And a lot of it leaks at that stage. They then have to pipe it over to processing facilities to purify it into closer to pure methane. And then there's a huge network of pipelines crisscrossing the country. And those pipelines are have compressor stations running along them that pressurize the gas by burning some of it and releasing emissions. And those emissions can have serious health impacts, particularly if you live near one of the power plants that's burning a lot of the gas. like Kennedy's would. Um, One of the most dangerous pollutants for your health is just particulate matter. PM 2.5 has no known safe amount. And there's a study coming out soon that will show that, that's particularly going to be a concern. It also releases volatile organic compounds like formaldehyde, releases nitrogen oxides that can break down in sunlight and release ozone and create smog. Um, and Burning methane also releases still about half as much carbon dioxide as coal does per unit of energy generated, which is still way too much. Plus, all of the methane that leaks all along that supply chain is a greenhouse gas itself. And in fact, methane for the first 20 years after it's been released is about 80 times as potent in its warming effect than CO2. Um, so there are a lot of concerns. There are also safety risks with living near a pipeline, which potentially could explode. Gas prices are also very, very volatile, and it's the biggest driver of our electric prices. This chart shows how prices have changed from 2019 through 2024. And you can see there's a big spike in February of 2022. And that was when the war in Ukraine started. This is a global market, and we're increasingly going to be exposed to even more global disruptions because there's been this huge rush to build out more and more export capacity for liquefied natural gas. Up until 10 years ago or so, it had actually been illegal to export oil or gas, and had been that way since the oil embargo in the 70s. Is a national security concern that kind of quietly got changed by Congress. Um, and now that there are a bunch of LNG export terminals, we're going to be exposed to not only volatility, but just higher prices in Europe and Asia, where the gas is being shipped to can cost twice as much as it does here, where we have a ton of production. So that's going to put upward pressure on prices. Plus, domestic production is expected to peak in 2027. So thereafter, supply is going to be going down, demand's going to be going up, and that's a recipe for big growth in prices. So here's a map that shows where the major gas pipelines are in our state. Upstate is served largely by the Williams Transco line or Transcontinental pipeline. Sonat crosses over around Augusta from Georgia. You can see that Elba Express line is a Kinder Morgan line that runs kind of parallel to the Savannah River and brings gas to the Elba Island liquefied natural gas export terminal down by Savannah. And then CGT is Carolina Gas Transmission, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, and actually has an existing pipeline that runs to the Kennedy site that provided auxiliary fuel for cold starts at the coal plant, but it wouldn't have enough capacity for a large combined cycle gas plant. Um, there was a kind of secretive bidding process that took place at the beginning of this year, wrapped up in February, for proposals to supply gas to the Kennedy's power plant. Carolina Gas Transmission lost out to a Kinder Morgan proposal, and they have been protesting it, including with a full page ad in the state newspaper. And they've been intervening in regulatory proceedings. Um, and there, while we don't want this plant, and we, really don't want any new pipeline, they kind of have a point that their proposal would have gone right along that existing right of way, right next to the current pipeline that already runs to the site. And so it wouldn't have impacted new parcels of private property. It would have had fewer environmental impacts in terms of habitat degradation. and I think it could have been cheaper too. But Kinder Morgan ended up winning out with a project they're calling the Elba Bridge that would connect to the Elba Express line and cross Hampton County and Colleton County along kind of the upper end of the Ace Basin, crossing the Savannah River, the Ashepoo River, the Combahee River, and lots of other smaller bodies of water. And the Ace Basin is, as many of y'all know, I'm sure, a really important habitat. It's the largest, mostly undeveloped wetland on the Atlantic coast. And this pipeline that's been proposed would also cross more than 100 parcels of private property, which would be subject to seizure through eminent domain. So we really need to get the word out to property owners. Um, Part of the reasoning that seems to be behind the utility's decision to select that alternative is that Kinder Morgan also is developing big projects upstream of the Elba Express pipeline. Uh, those two are called SSE4 or Southeast Supply Enhancement 4, which runs all the way across Georgia, Alabama, and into Mississippi. And that's an expansion of an existing line. It's called a looping project, where they're kind of adding extra pipe around some existing capacity. And that would connect to a totally new pipeline that would cross from the northwest corner of Mississippi to the southeast corner of the state. That's called Mississippi Crossing. And Dominion has entered into precedent agreements to buy capacity on all of these Kinder Morgan pipelines with the intent for a lot of it to go to the Canadies power plant. Now, this whole deal is going to open up more capacity for exporting gas through the Elba Island terminal. It's going to open up opportunities for more power plants, like another one Santee Cooper is looking to build in Early Branch potentially. It's also going to open up the possibility for more industrial facilities that might burn gas and come locate around the low country. Um, until recently, we hadn't been able to get a hold of the map for the Elba Bridge pipeline. We had been trying, and we've been having a number of community engagement events around the Canadies plant and the pipeline proposal. And at a recent event that the Conservation League held with some partner organizations at Duke's Barbecue in Walterboro, we actually got a hold of that map finally. You can see some pictures from that event, including on the right, the unfurling of a map from by Stephen Murdaugh, who's a county council member in Colleton County. And that made the news. A couple days later, I saw that Kinder Morgan released the map to their investors right after we kind of put it out in the media. And here's a copy of that map. So you see it's the orange line that connects over to the Elba Express line in Scriven County, Georgia, crosses the Savannah River all the way across Hampton County, basically all the way across Colleton County, right up to the Edestay River. And, it's going to impact a lot of people and have a lot of bad impacts on habitats and special places and historic sites potentially if we're not able to stop it. So we want to spread the word now, and we'll continue to kind of keep folks posted on opportunities to engage and push back on this. But kind of on that note, it helps to understand some of the framework of how electric utilities and pipeline companies are regulated. The principal regulator of electric and gas utilities in our state is the South Carolina Public Service Commission. The main split in terms of utility regulation is based on the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which reserves regulation over interstate commerce for the federal government and leaves all other matters to the states. So electric and gas distribution utilities kind of parcel off their operations into state level operating companies so that they're governed at the state level. So the PSC has authority over their rate making as natural monopolies, and it also has oversight of their long range planning for how they intend to meet their forecasted future demand. Um, One thing that changed in our state for the better following the VC Summer project failure back in 2017 uh, were some regulatory reforms that came out of Columbia that increased PSC oversight of Santee Cooper, the state-owned power authority. The PSC does not have authority over Santee Cooper's rates, but now with that new law, they do get to review and approve or reject Santee Cooper's integrated resource plans. And those are filed every 3 years. The next round will be in 2026. And they also have substantial update proceedings every year in between. The PSC also has the authority to review major electric facilities under the South Carolina Siting Act, including power plants and big transmission lines. And in order to proceed with construction, the utilities have to receive a certificate of environmental compatibility and public convenience and necessity. Um, and then finally, assuming that a new power plant was included in an integrated resource plan where they chart out kind of a general direction of the types of generation they might pursue. And then it makes it through a Siting Act review and gets a CPCN where they've put forward specific specs for the plant and cost estimates. Well, after it starts construction, they would have to ultimately then come in for a rate case where they would have to justify the money they actually spent and explain any cost overruns in order to get it added in to rates through a rate increase. So those are all important touch points where organizations like the Conservation League intervene and try to look out for consumers and the environment. And all of these proceedings have opportunities for public comments. We'll often put out a call for comments like we did around a plan Santee Cooper has to expand its transmission infrastructure through Audubon's Beidler Forest. That resulted in there were 1,850 public comments submitted in total, which is far and away the most the PSC's ever gotten on anything. People really love Beidler. And 1,299 of those, or 70%, were from click-throughs on the form that we sent out in an action alert email. So if you sign up for our emails, it's a good way to hear about these opportunities to engage, and we try to make it easy for folks. The pipeline side of things is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. They also have oversight of interstate transmission rates and transmission planning, and will be engaged in the proceeding for the Elba Bridge pipeline once that spins up. There will also be opportunity for public comment. And you might also be able to meet with FERC commissioners. The rules are pretty tight on not being able to lobby the PSC commissioners, but you can actually lobby the FERC commissioners. So we're probably going to set up some meetings. And then finally, there are also a litany of other agencies that will review particular aspects of an application, like the Department of Environmental Services, which has oversight of air permits and will look at water impacts under the U.S. Clean Water Act. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would be responsible for endangered and threatened species impacts. Corps of Engineers, Army Corps of Engineers would look at, floodplain risks, and, there can potentially be others. Sometimes there are cultural reviews and things like that too. So more opportunities for public comment there. The PSC members are appointed by the General Assembly from 7 districts across the state. And a lot of that process is run by the General Assembly's Public Utilities Review Committee, which also has oversight of kind of how well the existing commissioners are doing their job from their view. And we're one of only two states where commissioners are appointed by the legislature. In other states, they're either appointed by the governor or elected directly by the public. The one other state is Virginia, where they've also got Dominion Energy. That's where they're based. So the publicly owned utilities, like I mentioned, Santee Cooper is not subject to rate regulation by the PSC. They have their own board that also a lot of them are appointed, and they can approve rate increases at their own discretion. Uh, Santee Cooper has about 200,000 customers they directly serve in Horry, Georgetown, and Berkeley counties, but 70% of the power they produce is sold to the electric cooperatives. There are 19 of them in our state. That's a map of them in the bottom left. And they procure their power mostly through Central Electric, which is like a collectively owned buying authority. And they get most of their power from Santee Cooper. The electric cooperatives, I should say, also have their own boards. If you're a member of one, you can run to be on it. Um, Let me know if you're interested. So the big energy bill that passed this year became known as Act 41, or the South Carolina Energy Security Act, upon passage. And it came out of House Bill 3309, which you may have heard about while we were actively engaging around this. The picture of me on the top right, testifying before a legislative committee. One of the things that it does is it provided authorization for Santee Cooper to partner with Dominion on the Kennedy's gas plant. They have to get legislative approval to do a joint venture with a for-profit company. Um, there are also just so many provisions impacting utility regulation in there that I really can't even begin to scratch the surface in the time we've got today. But I'd be happy to dig in more with folks. Through extensive lobbying, though, we were able to remove some of the worst provisions. We got some good things added into. One thing that got a fair amount of attention was a provision that initially would have cut the size of the commission from 7 members to 3, which potentially would have further shifted the balance of things in the utility's favor. We were able to defeat that. Um, we got some good rules around solar siting, lots of things in there. At the end of the day, though, the final bill does overwhelmingly favor the utilities and is mostly designed to help fast track billions of dollars of investments in new gas infrastructure by streamlining, as they say, regulatory processes. One of the key changes in that regard is setting a new 180-day deadline on those Siting Act reviews. So once a application for a CPCN certificate of need is submitted to the PSC for the Kennedy's plant, things are going to move quickly. So it's important to stay tuned for opportunities to engage. And, it'll be a little more challenging for intervening parties like the Conservation League too, but we're definitely gearing up and have a lot of resources prepared and getting ready to fight that fight. So, as we approach the second half of this 2-year legislative session in January, we've determined what our legislative priorities are when it comes to energy policy. And most of these are things that we tried to get added to House Bill 3309 last year, but just weren't able to get over the finish line. Uh, One of them is just requiring basic uh, notice to landowners that are potentially subject to eminent domain for a pipeline. I think it's kind of hard to argue against that. So hopefully we'll get some traction, but if you know folks in the path of this pipeline, we definitely need them to speak out. We also are fighting to reduce that cost shifting from data centers onto everybody else that pays an electric bill. And we're also trying to get some basic requirements push the utilities to make the energy efficiency investments they need to, set some reasonable targets. And if they refuse to try and hit those, then perhaps administration of those projects needs to be taken over by an independent third party that isn't swayed by the profit motive to try and minimize energy efficiency. And then finally, a little longer term, somewhat lesser priority for right now is trying to require more best practices in transmission planning, which over time will be able to help to alleviate upward pressure on rates, improve reliability, and enable more deployment of renewable energy. And the key ways you can help are laid out here. By far, the most valuable thing you can do is meet in person with your legislators. I know I already heard from Judith about some great work she's done on that front. And kind of the other ones are in declining order of impact. After that, phone calls, writing to them, a handwritten letter is more likely to get noticed than an email. A personal email is more likely to get noticed than just clicking on a form letter like we might send out in an action alert. It's great to have numbers, but that kind of personal connection is really what moves the needle the most. You can also try and engage the media by writing letters to the editor and op-eds, and amplify your impact by telling your friends. And then finally, we can always use more funds at the conservation organizations that are busy lobbying in Colombia and intervening before regulators and organizing community members. We would welcome donations. And, if y'all have any questions, I'd be happy to stick around and answer them. And hopefully this is just the beginning of a longer conversation. But we definitely appreciate uh, all of y'all's interest and hope that we can work together to try and advocate for a brighter energy future in South Carolina.